Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video, we will talk about unsupervised learning. We're going to go briefly over the machine learning types that I presented last week, just to remind them to you, and then we are going to dive right into unsupervised learning. Just a short reminder of the types of machine learning. In supervised learning, you input training data and a desired output value. And you train the model like that. Ideally, the algorithm correctly determines the output values for unseen instances. An example here would be detecting a face given annotated images. So what you need to remember is that you are given training data and desired outputs or labels. In unsupervised learning, the topic of today's lecture, the algorithm learns patterns exclusively from unlabeled data. As an example, grouping news by topic. For instance, Google News or Yahoo News, pretty much all news websites have this functionality. So what you need to remember here is that you are given training data without the desired outputs, so without labels. In reinforcement learning, an agent takes actions in an environment in order to maximize a reward, which accumulates over time. This is why it's called a cumulative reward. So an example here would be a robot learning to walk, fly, play chess, and so on. So what you need to remember in reinforcement learning is that you are given rewards for sequences of actions. And in semi-supervised learning, on the other hand, you are given training data and only a few desired outputs. So you have some labels, but not all of them. But why use unsupervised machine learning at all? There are several reasons to use unsupervised machine learning. Some of them I will mention briefly. First of all is insight discovery. So in unsupervised learning, we can uncover useful insights from the input data provided. Then secondly, we have human-like learning in unsupervised learning because it mimics the way humans learn from their own experiences, so it's more easily interpretable by humans. The third reason why use unsupervised learning is that we can do unlabeled data training. These models are trained on unlabeled data, which means they work directly with uncategorized data. And lastly, in real-world applications, unsupervised learning can be crucial really, because often there are datasets which are unstructured and lack predefined labels. So unsupervised learning becomes necessary to handle such datasets in an effective manner. And now if we looked at unsupervised learning as an idea, we have unlabeled data, right? We have an algorithm that we apply to this unlabeled data. And what we hope for is that we discover some patterns in the data and we can group this unlabeled data into groups with the same attributes or characteristics as you can see over here. So as opposed to supervised learning, here we have just the x1, xn input data class, right? Which is unlabeled. And what we would like to do is to identify patterns, to make some kind of sense of the structure of the data. And one way to do so, to derive this structure, is by clustering the data based on the relationships among the variables in the data. So you need to remember that in unsupervised learning, there is no feedback based on the prediction results. And one good example here is biological network clustering, which is an unsupervised learning problem, and it is usually done with clustering algorithms, as you can see over here. So you have a set of data and then you cluster them in different groups with data that has similar attributes, right? Now let's look at this example. This is a visualization of gene expression data. Given this type of data, you can group individuals into groups with similar characteristics, as you can see over here, right? What you see here is a heat map of gene expression values for leukemia patients, and these columns that I showed you are clustered using gene expressions, and then they are color-coded by disease type. So this one is AML, this one is ALL, this one is CLL, and so on. We have many types of unsupervised learning, but today we will focus on clustering and dimensionality reduction. And the way to think about this is in terms we classified supervised learning last week. So if we're talking about data structure, if we think the data is discrete, then we can apply clustering algorithms. And if we think it is continuous, then we apply dimensionality reduction algorithms. This might be difficult. So in the beginning, it might be difficult to say, but what you can do, one way to deal with it is that you plot the data even when you don't have any labels. And from the plots you can observe, is the data largely organized in discrete groups or clusters, similar to what you saw on the previous slide, for instance, or does it seem to be more spread out, in a way distributed more continuously? But now let's look at clustering as an idea, right? So in clustering, like I said, we group objects into clusters so that objects with similar characteristics or attributes, if you will, are placed in the same group or cluster. And then we make sure that other objects with fewer similarities belong to other groups. Two algorithms that are very well known here and that we're going to look at in more detail soon are k-means clustering and dbScan. Next, in dimensionality reduction techniques, we aim to reduce from high dimensional to low dimensional spaces without compromising the important properties of the original data. So these types of methods are often used in exploratory data analysis or pre-processing, and we do that to prepare for modeling and so on. Two well-known methods here are PCA, principal component analysis, and autoencoders. We will look at PCA later on today, but autoencoders we will encounter in other courses later on, maybe in the machine learning course, for instance. Other examples of clustering, for instance, organizing computer clusters, or social networks, where you can determine which users are friends with each other, or you can detect communities. Many companies also use market segmentation to determine groups of customers they want to advertise to. And then it is used fairly often in astronomical data analysis. This kind of analysis is fairly complex and specific, so we're not going to cover it, obviously, in this course. But clustering algorithms can be applied in many fields, for instance, in marketing, for finding groups of customers with similar behavior, given a large database of customer data. In biology, beyond this bioinformatics example that we saw with the heat map earlier on, we could have, for instance, classification of plants and animals given their features. In insurance, we can identify groups of insurance policyholders. We can identify frauds. And there are also some more exotic fields that clustering algorithms can be employed in. For instance, in earthquake studies, where we could use clustering on observed earthquake epicenters to identify dangerous zones. So these are just some examples, just a few examples of what can be achieved with clustering. But let's look now at k-means clustering. But before that, I'm going to remind you a little bit about this supervised learning techniques and the whole idea behind it. So we are producing so much data today that most of our data samples are unlabeled because labeling requires human effort and additional costs. So this is where unsupervised learning techniques come to use. We employ them to reduce the need of data labeling. And one of these techniques, like we saw previously, is clustering, where algorithms automatically group data samples based on their similarities. If these examples were instead labeled, this kind of grouping would be classification, as we saw last week. The k-means clustering algorithm is among the most common ones that we use in machine learning. what k-means does is it partitions data samples into k predefined clusters, which are distinct and non-overlapping. This is important to remember. And then k is chosen by the user. So suppose we have some data samples, x1, xn, right? And then this xi, xi1, xi2, xid is a vector in a real valued space, and this is the number of dimensions in the data. So what we want to do here, I'm reminding you, is to divide these data samples into k clusters. And we do this through an iterative process employing this k-means algorithm. Now, each cluster K has a cluster center, CK, also called a centroid. And the aim of the algorithm is to find the best split of x1, xn, these ones from here, right? These are the samples, and we want to split them into K groups so that the total distance between the members of a group and its corresponding centroid is minimized. So the centroid is representative in the group, and the distance between the members of the group and the centroid has to be minimized. And the algorithm goes as follows. So first, we are given the k number of clusters, and then randomly choose the k centroids, C1, CK. I remind you, the core concept of the k-means algorithm is to divide the dataset into these clusters. So it begins by initializing k random centroids or seeds. Then each of these assigns each data point to the nearest cluster based on the distance. And we can have the Euclidean distance, like in equation 1 over here. But there are other types of distances. We're not going to go into them now. And once all instances have been assigned to clusters, the centroids are updated. They're recalculated based on the mean of the points in each cluster. This cycle of reassigning data points and updating centroids continues and can lead to changes in cluster membership. So as these centroids are changing, also the points can change the cluster that they are members of. And this process repeats either for a set number of iterations, t, like you can see in the pseudocode over here on the right, or until the cluster doesn't change anymore. So if we look now at the convergence criterion, either no or minimum reassignments of data points to different clusters appears, or there is no change of centroids, or there is a minimum change of centroids. We can decide this, or there is a minimum decrease in the sum of square errors, right? And now if you look at another algorithm, dbScan, this is a density-based clustering algorithm, and it stands for density-based clustering of applications with noise. So first, let's unpack what density-based clustering means. Essentially, it means clustering based on local clusters or following a local cluster criterion, such as density connected points property, which we'll define soon, or it can be based on an explicitly constructed density function. Some major features here of density-based clustering are density-based clustering can discover clusters of arbitrary shape, it can handle noise, and it needs density parameters. Now, the most well-known of these algorithms is, like I said, dbScan, and the whole idea behind it is quite simple. Divide the entire dataset into dense regions, separated by sparse regions, as you can see over here, for instance. And before we look into the actual algorithm, we need to establish a few core concepts. So let's get into it. I will sometimes use the terms points and objects interchangeably. So you should know that I'm referring to the same thing, right? So what I said earlier is that density-based clustering divides the entire dataset into dense regions separated by sparse regions, which effectively means that it locates regions of high density and separates them from the ones with low density. And now we have a few definitions. So what the density is the number of points within a specified radius epsilon, right? And a core point is a point with at least a minimum number of neighboring points, these min points, in this circle of radius epsilon. So here, min points is 3. A border point, so this was a core point. A border point, like this one, this is not a core point, but has a core point in its neighborhood. And we're going to formally define neighborhoods in just a bit. The density at a border point is less than min points, but a core point is less than epsilon distance away from it. So, as you can see, this is a core point, this is a border point. And then a noise point is neither a border point nor a core point. And that's it. This is the intuition behind these concepts. But now let's define them more formally. So, we have these points over here, right? So bear with me. Epsilon in dbScan defines the radius of the neighborhood around each data point. And this way, it determines the maximum distance that 2 points can be from each other to be considered neighbors. So, if the distance between 2 points is less than or equal to epsilon, then they're considered to be in each other's neighborhood. And points within this distance are considered to be part of the same cluster. So, this is the epsilon neighborhood of P with epsilon radius. And this is the epsilon neighborhood of Q with epsilon being the radius. Now, the choice of epsilon here is crucial because it directly influences the cluster formation. A small epsilon value may lead to the creation of many small, tightly packed clusters, while a large epsilon value may merge different clusters into a single one. To select an appropriate value for epsilon, it's essential to consider the scale of the data and the desired density of the clusters. Sorry for that. Okay. Now, if we look at the other parameter, min points, this on the other hand specifies the minimum number of neighbors a point must have within this epsilon distance to be considered a core point. Points that don't have enough neighbors to meet the min number of points that are required are classified either as border points or noise points, right? So now we can see that P is a core point here. Its minimum min points is 4 because it has the required number of min points. But Q is not a core point because it does not have the minimum number of points, right? And then also selecting the right minimum number of points. This value is essential for obtaining meaningful clusters. If minimum points is set too low, noisy points might be included in clusters, which results into artificially dense clusters. On the other hand, if min points is set too high, it could prevent the detection of some clusters, particularly in areas where data density is lower. So understanding the density of data is really important, and then setting this epsilon is also very important. So you have to consider it carefully and experiment with both this epsilon and min points to get a balance and achieve meaningful clustering results. And now let's look at another 2 core concepts. First of all, let's look at how a point Q can be directly density reachable. So a point Q is directly density reachable from P if Q is within the epsilon neighborhood of P and P is a core point, as you can see over here. So Q is directly density reachable from P, but P is not directly density reachable from Q. And this has to do with the minimum number of points. Then the second important concept is density connectivity. So a point P is density connected to Q with respect to epsilon and min points if there is a point O, so we have P, Q, and O, such that both P and Q are density reachable from O, as you can see, with respect to epsilon and min points. So P and Q are density connected to each other by O over here, and an important thing to remember is that density connectivity is symmetric. And let's look also at the formal definition of a cluster. A cluster C in a set of points D with respect to epsilon and min points is a non-empty subset of D satisfying these two properties. So the first property is maximality, which says that for all points PQ, if P is in the cluster and if Q is density reachable from P with respect to epsilon and min points, then also Q is in the cluster. Connectivity for all points PQ from the cluster, if P is density connected to Q with respect to epsilon and min points in D. So this is a given. And to note here is that a cluster contains core points as well as border points. And noise points are the points which are not directly density reachable from at least one core point. And now, if we look at the dbScan algorithm, so what we have to do is, first step, arbitrarily select a point P, then retrieve all points that are density reachable from P with respect to epsilon and min points that are given. If P is a core point, then a cluster is formed. If P is a border point, no points are density reachable from P, and dbScan visits the next point. And we continue this process until all points have been processed. Now that we looked at the algorithm, we have to also make a note that comparing to k-means, dbScan works well in the presence of outliers and noise. And you probably can imagine why, right? But it also has some limitations. And it is a versatile algorithm, but some of the limitations are, first off, we have difficulty with clusters of varying densities. So dbScan works best when clusters have uniform densities. It struggles with datasets where clusters have different densities, and that leads to inconsistencies in clustering. Secondly, there is sensitivity to data scaling, sensitivity. Since dbScan relies on a distance metric to define the neighborhoods, if data features are on different scales, then it can result in irregular cluster shapes and less accurate results. Therefore, it's important to standardize or normalize the data. Then we can have challenges with high dimensional data. In high dimensional spaces, we deal with the curse of dimensionality. If you remember, we discussed this a few lectures ago. The curse of dimensionality diminishes the effectiveness of the distance metric, and it makes it harder to identify meaningful neighborhood relationships. And lastly, another limitation is the computational cost. dbScan can be computationally intensive for large datasets and requires careful tuning of parameters to achieve optimal performance. And now that we looked at dbScan, let's look into dimensionality reduction algorithms. So dimensionality reduction involves decreasing the number of features or variables in a dataset while retaining the most critical information. This is a technique which is particularly valuable when we handle datasets with many features, because it helps simplify the data and it makes it easier to work with the data, but also acts as some sort of regularization. So there are several benefits to dimensionality reduction. First of all, by limiting the number of features, we can decrease the computational complexity of our models, leading to faster training and prediction times. It also helps preventing the overfitting. If you remember, overfitting happens when a model fits the training data well, but it fails to generalize to new data because it captures noise or irrelevant patterns. So overfitting often occurs when a model has too many features or it is overall complex. And another reason to use dimensionality reduction algorithms is that they help in visualizing high dimensional data by projecting it onto lower dimensions, and in this way they make it easier to explore and understand complex datasets. This can reveal patterns and relationships that might not be visible in higher dimensional data, right? So it's important to note that scaling the data before applying these techniques is also crucial because they are sensitive to differences in scale of the variable. So if you have variables in different scales, then it can be very sensitive to that. And the algorithm that we're going to look at here is principal component analysis, which is a fundamental technique for dimensionality reduction. While the mathematical aspects may be complex, the main idea is fairly intuitive. So let's take it step by step. First of all, PCA transforms the original variables into a new set of variables, which are called principal components. These are linear combinations of the original variables, and they are designed to capture the maximum amount of variance in the data. To understand this concept, imagine a dataset with many highly correlated variables, which is leading to redundancy and is difficult to spot patterns in. PCA simplifies this kind of dataset by generating new variables that are uncorrelated, and it enables us to extract the most important information. These new variables are ranked by their significance, and this is allowing us to focus on the most critical components and to discard the less important components. So in other words, principal component analysis aims to identify a new coordinate system for the feature representation and then arranging the the dimensions based on the amount of data variability along these dimensions. So the idea is that dimensions with greater data provide more sensitivity for distinguishes between data points. So with more data, in the sense with more data spread, the more data is spread, then the more sensitivity we get, right? And then these are most informative points. This concept you can see here illustrated in this figure, right? And the direction with the largest variance in the data is known as the first principal component. Then the second principal component, which is orthogonal or perpendicular to the first, has a lower variance. In higher dimensions, each subsequent principal component is also perpendicular to the previous ones, with decreasing variance along those directions. So if you think about it, if we could only use a single value to represent the data, we would choose the first principal component because it captures the most significant differences among the data points. Including additional principal components only improves the data representation because they provide more detail, and using all principal components is equivalent to transforming the coordinate system but retaining all the information from the original data. But now let's look how it looks like. So how it works is that it first begins by creating a covariance matrix that measures the relationships between every pair of variables in the dataset. Next, it calculates the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the covariance matrix. The eigenvectors indicate the directions of maximum variance, while the eigenvalues represent the magnitude of that variance. Then the eigenvalues are arranged in descending order, with higher values indicating greater variance which is captured by the corresponding eigenvector. And then to select the principal components, a subset of eigenvectors or principal components is chosen based on how much of the total variance they explain. If you don't recall eigenvalues and eigenvectors from your earlier linear algebra classes, please look into them again because this becomes fairly intuitive once you recall these two concepts. And then the last step is projecting the data. In this step, the original data is projected onto the selected principal components, and we create in this way a lower dimensional representation. So this was all for now. Thank you for listening and see you in the next video.